Hello, everybody. My name is Shirley Jordan. I am Professor of French Studies at Newcastle University, and I'm really delighted to have been asked to interview Dr. Polly Galis, who is winner of the 2019 Peter Lang Young Scholars Competition in French Studies. Polly is a specialist in contemporary women's writing, and her book is entitled Frank French Feminisms, Sex, Sexuality and the Body in the work of Ernaux, Huston and Arcan. And it is just on the point of being hot off the press. We expect to have it in our hands in mid-March, and it is to be published in the Contemporary Studies in Contemporary Women's Writing series that's edited by Jill Rye. So we're going to have a conversation today about Polly's book and about what winning the prize means to her. So first of all, many congratulations, Polly, on this fantastic achievement of winning the award. And I'm going to start with a rather obvious question. It's a question to which, in fact, I already know at least part of the answer, because I had the privilege and pleasure of examining your PhD some years ago, to which this monograph is related. And I have to say, it will be so wonderful to hold this book in my hands now. It's reached its definitive form and is about to be widely disseminated, and I'm sure it will be a great feeling for you. So my first question then is, can you talk me through the origins of your project? Where did it begin and why?
Thank you very much for your kind introduction, Shirley, and for the opportunity of an interview, and for, yes, examining my Viva all those years ago. It feels very special to be interviewed by you this evening about my book, which originated from my thesis, which I completed at the University of Leeds in 2019. And the themes I explored in my thesis were very much the same as those I address in the book. So representations of sex and sexuality and the body within the work of Ernaux, Huston and Arcan. But the book revision process has really allowed me to kind of refine my focus. So both in terms of narrowing my focus in some areas and then expanding my focus in others. So in terms of narrowing my focus, I've made considerable cuts and edits and cut out one section that was slightly less focused on sex and the body. And then in terms of expanding my focus, the book project allowed me to develop this concept of a frank contribution to French feminism, which I already had the foundations for within my thesis, but I hadn't really expressed in those words explicitly. And I think that really struck me as a key core concept during my Viva examination, and through my conversations with yourself and Professor Fell, and I was then able to develop that concept in more detail within my book. So I'm very grateful for those conversations, which allowed me to decide how to develop the book since its origins. Thanks,
Polly. That's wonderful to hear in terms of process and the evolution of the project, both for the thesis and post-thesis. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit more about the real specifics, the nitty-gritty of what your book is about. The title, obviously, gives a good indication and tells us a lot about what it covers, but can you take us just a little bit more deeply into the subject matter?
Okay, sure. Overall, in broad terms, the book is predominantly about women's sexual and bodily experiences, as represented in the work of Annie Ernaux, Nancy Huston and Nelly Arcan. And I argue that through these representations, the authors offer a kind of frank contribution to French feminisms. And I arrive at that conclusion through analysis of certain tensions within their works. Tensions between more obviously feminist tropes and messages, and then seemingly unfeminist ones on the other hand. So, for example, all three authors contest forms of sexism and gender inequality, which they perceive to be at stake in popular culture and contemporary society. But then, on the other hand, their works are populated by objectified women or subservient or dominated women. So within this book, I'm really interested in unpicking those paradoxes. And I hope to have shown that through this complex and perhaps more messy portrayal of sex and the body, the authors provide perhaps a more accurate reflection of women's lived realities, which therefore prove more productive from a feminist viewpoint.
Thank you, Polly. I'm really interested in this idea of frank feminism that you're raising as quite a major contribution really to feminist thinking. I wonder if you could give me just another small example of where that frankness lies, just so we can really grasp the importance of that concept within your book.
Sure. So the way I've explained it to people in the past in a nutshell, when we're thinking about it in comparison to a UK context, for example, is to cite the example of the guilty feminist from the podcast and book of the same name, which is very popular in the UK. And the concept behind that is that, it's all very well to have, feminist values and feminist morals, but it's sometimes far more difficult to live a perfect feminist life and to be a kind of ideal feminist, because we often behave in unfeminist ways. And that rather than feeling deterred by that, we should acknowledge and accept those kind of inconsistencies and foibles within ourselves. And then by recognizing our mistakes, we can learn from them. And so acknowledging our guilty feminist ways is perhaps more productive from a feminist point of view. So I'd say my understanding of a frank form of feminism in these authors' works is not dissimilar. So a lot of the time, the characters or narrative voices will reflect their, certain, I suppose, a guilty feminist way of behaving. But then sometimes I think the authors also make us challenge what we understand by feminist behaviors and whether and whether that's necessarily a positive thing. So, for example, Nelly Arcan and Nancy Huston and Annie Ernaux will show us examples of women in seemingly disempowered positions, which enable these women to be empowered or to enjoy themselves. Or they show us examples of women who may be enjoying sexually submissive positions or being the object of male desire and abuse, which in some cases can be therapeutic, providing those women are consenting. Arcan, for example, has a very hypersexualized, hyper-feminine physical image and appearance. And many have said that that's at odds with her so-called position as a writer and philosopher and feminist figure. And yet she argues, and many critics have argued, that that hyper-feminine public persona in actual fact reflects the impossibility of existing outside of our social conditioning as women. So those are just some examples of the ways of what I mean by the kind of frank offering to French feminisms. It's kind of accepting our inconsistencies or our hypocrisies and paradoxes as women, and kind of achieving a franker understanding of feminine identity and feminist values and action.
That's great. That's a wonderful response to the question, Polly. There's a kind of pragmatism then underlying the concept, really.
Exactly.
I wonder if you can tell us as well something about the way the book's written, and why you chose to write it in that way.
Sure. So in terms of structural decisions, I suppose the main decision was not to apply a singular fixed fictional feminist theory or framework to my analysis. So as I was saying, the kind of frank feminist approach in the studied author's works is quite unusual and original and specific. So it didn't feel right to apply just one type of feminism or school of thought to an interpretation of their works. And actually, Ernaux, Huston, and Arcan do not align with a single feminist faction or ideology. And Ernaux and Huston actually reject the term feminist and woman writer for themselves, for reasons I explore in the book. So, you know, in many ways, this is my own interpretation of the texts. So I thought it would make more sense to allow the primary texts to speak for themselves. So I take as my starting point my analysis of how sexuality and the body is represented in their works. And then I kind of draw on a variety of feminist theories and concepts as and when is appropriate throughout the book. And then I allow that to lead the book and lead me to my conclusions about their frank feminist approach. And then the second key structural decision was to opt for a thematic structure rather than looking at each author in turn. And for me, that was especially important because I wanted to highlight synergies between Huston, Ernaux, and Arcan's narrative approaches and messages. And it's especially important for those authors because there are so many things about them which is different. So they come from very different national contexts, very different backgrounds, writing at very different times in history. They explore different themes and write in different styles. And I explore a broad range of their works as well. So I thought there was already a lot going on, already quite a few differences between their works. So for me, it was really important to highlight the similarities between their corpuses as much as possible. Yeah, so those were the two main decisions about how to structure and frame the book.
Yeah, absolutely great decisions, Polly, that you didn't make it easy for yourself in a way, because that's actually quite a complex way of working out a trajectory through those three authors. But you know, it's one that really, really works.
Thank you.
I wonder if you can tell me a little bit more about what really appeals to you about these three authors that you've chosen. You said that they're very different in many ways, but clearly you have a strong connection and a real enjoyment of the work of each of them. So could you just say a tiny bit about that?
Sure. So I'd say the one that's, I suppose, I was drawn to the most obviously right from the very beginning was Nancy Huston. So my master's dissertation focused on transnational identity within Nancy Huston's works. And I was really interested in the border crossing between different national identities and linguistic identities within her work. And I suppose going forwards, when I was thinking about gender and representations of sex and the body in her work, I'm now also very much interested in the interplay between different borders and binaries within her work, but in terms of gender now, so between male and female identity, but also in terms of mind and matter. So kind of cerebral and versus bodily creation and states, and also artistic and literary creation. And I think, yeah, for Nancy, in terms of Nancy Huston's literature, that's what appeals to me the most, is that interplay between different binaries. And then in Ernaux's work, I know it's a cliche, but what I love most about her work is her depiction of working class girlhood and womanhood, which I think is one of the strongest aspects of her work. And also, I think the notion that you can learn about women's history and feminist history through her work, not through a kind of purely historical or theoretical summary, but through the depiction of very real feminine experiences, and the story, in some ways, sometimes the story of just one woman, but she's able to connect us to a specific moment in history and French history, but in a very personal way that allows you to feel it, on a very intimate level. That oscillation between the intimate and the collective is what I like most about Ernaux's work. And then in terms of Arcan's work, what appeals to me the most about her work is that in many ways it's a book about very personal, intimate suffering, and yet from having spoken to a great number of readers who've engaged with Arcan's work, I think similarly to Ernaux's work, lots of people are able to identify with the personal experiences she describes, and by feeling empathy for the reader, to also be able to find sympathy for their past selves as well, and to be able to sublimate feelings of shame through their reading of Arcan's experience, by realizing that personal experiences of shame are in many ways just social constructs and the consequence of, patriarchal structures and misogynist thinking. So yeah, what I love most about her work is that it's very much about personal suffering, but it can allow for collective healing, I think, amongst readers. It's definitely not easy reading, very painful and difficult sometimes, but I would encourage anyone to make the effort. And I think it can, that's what I love most about it, is its healing potential, I think, from a feminist perspective.
Thank you. That's really persuasive and full and passionate as a response, Polly. Let's move on just to talk a little bit more about the competition. So what was it that led you to apply for this prize in the first place?
So the first mention I heard of it was through my supervisor, one of my PhD supervisors, who recommended that I apply. So obviously that for me was already vouched for its legitimacy and importance, and made me feel confident in applying. And also, as I just finished my PhD, I was very keen to find a home for my thesis, so it would reach a wider audience. And I thought, what a better way of being published than also, becoming a prize-winning author. I thought that would be wonderful. And I knew that Peter Lang was a very reputable publisher, particularly within my field of contemporary culture and Francophone studies. So, yeah, there were just many benefits, and I thought I had nothing to lose but to try my luck. And I was fortunate enough to be awarded the prize within the contemporary women's writing category. And that was especially touching to me, just because I know, I've been very inspired by the series editor and the series author. So yeah, I saw it as a particular accomplishment to be able to have my book published among their number in that series. As well as, having all the benefits that come with being awarded the prize in general.
Okay, well, look, it's absolutely wonderful that your book is a part of that series now. I've just got another couple of small questions, and they're really questions that might that return to that question of issue of process and of how you you revised your thesis as a monograph, what some of the challenges might have been in doing that, how you overcame those challenges, and also maybe what you might recommend to other emerging scholars who are considering applying to similar prize competitions.
Sure. So challenges. I suppose the beginning bits of the revision process was the most straightforward part, because I knew from the Viva examination and reflections on my thesis what I wanted to change before publishing my work as a book, and I'd got some initial feedback from the publishers. So that was fairly straightforward. And the difficult part came when I received the reviewers' comments, as I believe is often the case. But I mean, it was a really, really fruitful and formative experience. I had immensely rich and useful feedback, and it, helped me to engage with a lot more secondary literature that's helped me as a researcher and writer more generally. And obviously it's helped make the book better overall. But it was more time consuming than I thought it would be. So if I was to recommend anything to other prize winners or early career researchers, it would be to make headway with the initial edits as soon as possible to allow yourself more time to respond to reviewers' feedback. And if I were to give advice about writing the proposal in the first place, I think that would be to not be afraid to stress the originality of your work and its timeliness as well. That's
wonderful, Polly. I'm sure that's really great advice that a number of people watching this will follow up on. I think we should draw it to a close, maybe, and I'll draw it to a close just with a final reminder of this fantastic new book and of the title of the book, which is Frank French Feminisms, Sex, Sexuality and the Body in the work of Ernaux, Huston and Arcan. And it's really highly recommended to anybody who's interested in contemporary women's writing in French or not in French, and in gender studies, sexuality and the body and so on. It has a really broad appeal and it's a fantastic book, Polly. So once again, many congratulations on your success.
Thank you so much.